Hey guys, so today we are gonna implement drag and drop in our inventory system. This is going to require a bunch of different changes throughout our code. We will need to change the inventory to organize its items based on the item slots instead of using a list of items. We'll need to implement a bunch more interfaces in the item slot class, like the begin and end drag, drag and drop, as well as implement events for all of those. In the character class, we'll need to implement methods to deal with each of those events, including but not limited to the drag and drop itself. Before we start our implementation, just to give you guys some context, the probably most straightforward way to make our items draggable would be to implement the iDrag handler in the item slot class, and implementing the iBegin drag handler and the end drag handler is also probably a good idea. And then in the onDrag method, which is called every frame that the drag is happening, we just need to set the position of our image to the position of our mouse cursor. It's probably also a good idea to save the initial position of our image in the onBegin drag method, and in the onEnd drag method, we reset the position of our image to that original position. Just by doing this, we can already see that we can drag items, and if we let go of them, they go back to their original spot. Unfortunately, this has some side effects. For example, you might notice that dragging some items, their images show up behind the images of the other items, which is probably not what we want. Besides, we need to have a bunch more control over this. We need to be aware of which slot we are dropping our item in, we need to know if it can go into that slot, and I don't think the item slot class is the appropriate place to have all that logic. So let's jump into our actual implementation for a more robust solution. So, like we said, the very first thing that we have to do is make some changes in the inventory class. We don't want this items list to have control over how our items are ordered, because now that we want to have drag and drop, we want to take control of that ourselves. So let's come down here into the add item, remove item and isFull methods, and we are just going to delete everything inside of them. These are going to be quite similar to what we have in the equipment panel, except we don't need to check if the item can be equipped in this slot. So very simply, we just need to loop through all of our item slots. As soon as we find one item slot that doesn't have an item in there, we are just going to put this item in that slot and return true, indicating that we were successful in adding this item to the inventory. If we managed to go through all of the slots and we didn't find a single slot that was empty, then we just return false. To remove an item, it's basically the same thing, so I'm just gonna copy this, but instead of checking if the slot doesn't have an item, we will check if the slot has the item that we want to remove, and if it does, then we'll return null, because we just removed it, and we return true to indicate that we were successful in removing the item from the inventory. Otherwise, we return false. The isFull method is extremely similar. We just need to go through all of the slots. If we find one that is empty, we'll just return false, because if at least one slot was empty, then the inventory definitely isn't full. But if we didn't find any slot that was empty, we are gonna say true, because then the inventory is full. So now that we have this items list here is only useful for us to allow us to have some starting items when we start out the game. So I still want to keep it around, but let's just change its name to reflect its current purpose. So I'm just going to change it to starting items. And I'm also going to rename this refreshUI method to be just called setStartingItems. So now that we renamed this variable, if we go back into Unity, we will lose all of the items that we had set in this list in the inspector, because since it has a new name, Unity thinks it's supposed to be a new list and it just deletes the old one and creates a new one. Knowing this, we can use a quite useful attribute that Unity provides us, which is formerly serialized as, and it's under the Unity engine.serialization namespace. And now we can open and close parentheses, and inside of this we can write the previous name of this variable. So now when we go back into Unity and it starts compiling our scripts, instead of thinking that this list is a new one and deleting the old list, because we set this attribute it's going to realize, oh, this list just changed its name, so let's keep all the values intact. So now that we have verified that the list has the new name, but it still kept all of those values that we had previously, we can go back into the script, and if we want, we can delete this, because the list has now been saved with the new name. Now we need to go into the item slot script and add the interfaces and the events that we're missing. So those are going to be the begin drag, and the drag, and drop. So because our character script or some other script that we eventually make to handle our interface is going to need to have access to what is being dragged and where it's being dropped, we need to make events just like the right-click event so that we can notify those other classes that an item is actually being dragged. So we're going to need something like on begin drag event, and so on and so forth. However, for these events, we actually need to have access to the item slot and not just the item. So in the name of consistency, I'm actually going to also change the right-click event to return an item slot, and we will have to change all the other places that use this event accordingly, but we'll do that in just a moment. And also for consistency, since we want the drag to be handled by a different class, why not have all pointer events be handled by a different class? So let's just make one event for each of the interfaces that we have added. So let's tell Visual Studio to implement the interfaces that we are missing. And let's scroll down. So here we actually need to pass the item slot, so it's going to be the keyword this, since we are already inside the item slot object. And we don't really need to check if the item is null. That's going to be the job of somebody else to check. So we can just delete this. And here, where we use the pointer enter event to show the tooltip, since we are, as we said, delegating all of the handling of the pointer events to another class, I also want to remove this from here and just call the events. And in the other class that ends up dealing with this, then that class will be responsible for showing and hiding the tooltip. So for each of these events, we just want to go if onPointerEnter event is different than null, then we will call the onPointerEnter event, passing in the keyword this to give the item slot to the other script. So here it's going to be the exit event, and so on and so forth. So now that we remove the code that shows and hides the tooltip, we don't actually need this anymore. Let's just get this out of here, because, as we said, some other class is going to have to deal with this now. So we might have a little problem here. If we want to properly detect all of these events, even on slots that are empty, we can't really disable the image, because that will make it unresponsive to all input. For example, we might want to drag an item into an empty slot, and that empty slot needs to at least respond to the drop event. But if it's disabled, it's not going to do anything. So instead of disabling our images, let's just make them completely transparent. We're gonna add two private color variables here. We're gonna name it this one normal color, and we're just going to assign it to color.white. Unity has these useful static variables that you can use to get most common colors. And we are gonna need another variable, and we are gonna call it disabled color. And this one, we are gonna assign it to a new color with 0 alpha. So all of these values, I'm setting them to 1, but it doesn't really matter what you set them to. The only one that matters is the last one, which is the transparency. So I'm setting it to 0 to make it completely transparent. And down here, instead of disabling the image, we are just gonna set its color to the disabled color. And down here, instead of enabling it, we are just gonna set its color to the normal color. However, this is very important. We did previously manually disable some of the images from the item slots, so we need to go into Unity and re-enable them all, otherwise we won't be able to use them at all. We do have some errors here because we changed the signature of our events, but we will fix those in just a moment. So what we need to do here is just go into the item slots and enable all of the images. Also go into the equipment panel and enable all of the images as well. The equipment panel, unlike the inventory, isn't programmed to update automatically in the editor, so by re-enabling the images, we will see these white squares by default here. So let's manually change this to be completely transparent. So now that our slots have events for all these types of inputs, let's also change the equipment panel and the inventory to match. To make this easier, I'm just going to copy the declarations of the events from the item slot. I'm going to come over to the inventory class and paste them, deleting the previous event that we had. And I'm going to do the exact same thing for the equipment panel class. And now in the start method, we want to assign all events of each slot to the corresponding event of the inventory, and the same thing in the equipment panel. I do realize this seems a bit tedious, and there's certainly alternatives instead of having this spam of events, but I do believe this is going to make our life easier when we get to the character class. Let's hop over to the character class and have it deal with all of the events that we just created. This class is actually going to receive some moderately big changes, so bear with me here. Let's first start out by deleting this, because we want to rework this entirely, and we'll also delete the equip and unequip methods. And this is where having a bunch of events actually makes our life easier. It's going to make our code quite readable, in my opinion at least. Let's start by having some comments to know what we are doing. Here we are going to set up the events. So when we right-click an item in the inventory, we know we want to equip it. When we right-click an item in the equipment panel, we know we want to unequip it. When we put our mouse over an item, whether it's in the inventory or the equipment panel, we want to show its tooltip. If we remove our mouse from that item, we want to hide the tooltip. And for the drag events, it's pretty self-explanatory. When we begin a drag, we just call the begin drag action, and drag, drag, and drop. And now we just need to actually implement all of these methods. Let's start from top to bottom. This is just a perfect spot to use the as keyword, because if the item inside the item slot isn't an equipable item or it's null, then the equipable item variable will also be null. So we just need to check if the equipable item isn't null and equip it in that case. Previously we didn't have to check for null because we were getting the item directly, but now that we are dealing with slots, we do have to check for it. For the unequip method, we are just going to do basically the same thing, but we are going to name this unequip. Now that we are dealing with the tooltips in here, we actually need access to a tooltip object, so let's add one now. It's going to be serialized field, item tooltip, and let's call it item tooltip. And we don't have a non-validate method, but let's actually make one now, and use it, as we usually do, to get the tooltip. So for the show tooltip method, we also need to check if the item is equipable, and if it is, we just need to go item tooltip.show tooltip, giving it the equipable item that we are dealing with. For the hide tooltip method, we just need to tell it to hide. For the drag and drop event, I don't want to bore you guys too much, so I'll quickly add empty methods for all of those, and we will implement them one by one. To drag an item inside a slot, we need to make sure that the item in that slot isn't null. So to fix our situation in the beginning, where dragging an item's image would cause it to go under the images of the other items, we actually need to create a separate object and correctly place it in the hierarchy to have it go above other objects. So let's add a reference to that in here. So we need a serialized field, image, and we are just gonna call this draggable item. in order to have the image class show up, we need to add the Unity engine.ui namespace. Let's go over to Unity and create this object. Let's just right-click our canvas and create a new UI image. We need to set it to the same size as the other inventory slots, so that's going to be 150 in both width and height, and a scale of 65%. That's because they are inside the character panel, which itself has a scale of 65%. And let's rename this to draggable item. It's very important to place this correctly in the hierarchy. Objects in the Unity UI are drawn from top to bottom. That means that objects that are placed lower in the hierarchy are going to be drawn above items that are above them in the hierarchy. At least in this case, we want the draggable item to be drawn above everything else, so it's the last game object in our canvas. So let's disable the raycast target option and disable the image component by default, and let's just move it out of the way. We also need to drag it into the draggable item slot in the character script. So you might be noticing here that even though we use the find object of type in the onValidate of the character script, the item tooltip wasn't found. That's because the method doesn't find disabled objects, and the item tooltip was disabled by default. So let's just drag it over here. And now that we're here, the stat tooltip should also be disabled by default. So let's do that now. Back in the code, we will also need a variable to tell us which slot has the drag started from. So let's just make a private item slot dragged slot. And in the begin drag method, the first thing that we're going to do is set the dragged slot to the item slot received as a parameter. After that, we need to grab our draggable item and set its sprite to the item sprite. We need to set its position to the position of our mouse cursor, and we need to actually enable it. While we are dragging, we need to continuously set the position of the draggable item to our mouse position, and when the drag ends, we need to set the dragged slot back to null, and we need to disable the draggable item. The drop method is where it gets a bit more complicated, because there's tons of different combinations that we have to take into account. If we drag an item from the inventory and we drop it into another slot in the inventory, then that's the simplest case of all. We just need to swap both items. But if we drag an item from the inventory into the equipment panel, first we need to check if the item is actually an equipable item, and then if it is, we need to check if it can go into the slot where we dropped it, and if it can, then the item that was in that slot needs to go into the inventory. And we'd also like to deal with the reverse case too, so if we take an item from the equipment panel and we drop it into an item slot in the inventory that already has an item in there, then ideally we would want them to swap. So let's say we grab a sword from the equipment panel and we drop it on top of an axe in the inventory, then they would swap positions. The axe would get equipped and the sword would get unequipped. But let's say we took the sword from the equipment panel and we dropped it on a shield, then that wouldn't be valid. You wouldn't be able to equip the shield in the same slot that we equipped the sword, so we need to check all of those cases. Oh, and I almost forgot, we do not want to update the draggable item's position if the draggable item is not enabled. As we said, the very basic thing that we want to do in the drop method is swap items between the slot where the drag started and the slot where the drag ended. So let's start our implementation by doing just that. This is the most ideal case, but unfortunately we won't be able to simply do this every time. Sometimes the items can't go into the slots where we try to drop them. So we need to find the most convenient way possible to know if the items can be swapped between each slot. After quite some iterations, and trust me, the first implementation I did of this method was the messiest piece of code I've ever seen, this is the most elegant solution that I could find. We'll need to go into the item slot script and add a new method that we are going to declare as public virtual bool, and we're going to call it can receive item. It's going to take as an input parameter an item, and it's basically going to return true or false to tell us whether we can put this item inside the slot. For regular item slots, it's basically just going to always return true. Since these are inventory slots, there's no restriction on what items they can have. In the equipment slot script, we need to override this method, and here we need to have some more conditions. If the item we are trying to put in the slot is null, we return true. Slots can always be empty. If not, we need to check if the item we are trying to put in this slot is an equipable item, and we do that by using the as keyword once again. And if it is an equipable item, we also need to check if its type corresponds to the type of the slot. Back in the drop method, I'm going to rename the input parameter first, just to make it more clear what this variable represents. And now, with the canReceiveItem methods, we just need to check if the slot where we are dropping the item can receive the item from the slot that started the drag, and we need to check if the slot that started the drag can receive the item from the slot where we are dropping it. But this isn't all. We need to also call the equip and unequip methods from the items where necessary, and if needed, update the stats panel. Once again, the cleanest way I found to do this is the following. First, we need to get the equipable item version of the item in each slot, and now we need to check two things: if the dragged slot is an equipment slot, and if the drop item slot is an equipment slot. If it's the first case, it means that we are dragging an item out of an equipment slot, so we need to check if the drag item is not null, and unequip it if so. And at the same time, it means that the drop item is going to go into this slot, so we need to equip it if it isn't null. In the other case, we need to do basically the same thing, but in reverse. We need to equip the drag item, and we need to unequip the drop item. Because this means that the item that we are dragging is going into an equipment slot, so we have to equip it, and it also means at the same time that whatever item was already in that slot is going out of it, so we need to unequip it. After this, we need to update the stat panel. So let's finally test this out in Unity and see the result of our work. Oh, I guess I made an oopsie. Of course, in the drag function, we need to update the position if the item is enabled, not if it isn't enabled. So let's try this again. And voila! We have working drag and drop in our items and inventory. Yay! I hope you have enjoyed this video, and see you next time.